Today's episode is brought to you by our company, NanoChomp Marketing Strategy and Analytics. We help product and marketing teams solve problems and experience growth using data and approachable AI. Visit nanochomp.com to learn more.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Soundbites. On this week's episode, we have Phil Ou. He's the founder of Blossomer. Blossomer is an agency designed to help founders handle operational complexities of early stage sales and marketing. And before founding Blossomer, Phil had several interesting product management roles at Google. He helped shape many of the products you may have heard of, such as YouTube and Google Photos. So Phil, thanks for joining.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Excited to get to talk about myself today. So thanks for indulging me.
Yeah, no, we love learning about what people have been up to, what they're working on, and just having good conversations. So thanks for taking the time.
Of course.
The way we like to start each episode is to tell us about your background a little bit. What got you on the path that you're on today? Any interesting tidbits? You can go as far back as you want.
Yeah. I like to say, I think a lot of my life can be summarized by right place, right time, and just meeting the right people. So I was born in Los Angeles, had immigrant parents. And so my dad was a mechanic. He worked in an auto shop. So I sort of knew from a young age, just based off how happy people were when they got their cars fixed, that I wanted to be some sort of builder. So decided to go to college at MIT, to study engineering. Specifically, initially I thought aerospace engineering because my favorite movie was Top Gun, and I thought I wanted build planes and rockets and things like that. Halfway through my freshman year, I actually took a hard pivot and decided to study electrical engineering and computer science, primarily because there was this kind of opportunity to essentially take a gap year and work for this YC startup in the Bay Area. And I remember when I told my parents this, who had never gone to college, they were just essentially, I think they sort of freaked out. Sure. Very understandably, in the sense of hey, you worked really hard to just achieve this kind of milestone. Why are you in such a rush to leave? And for me, I think it was just based out of curiosity, just something I wanted to try. And it turned out, I think, to be one of the best decisions I made my entire life. One was just super fun being an 18, 19-year-old, just having to figure out being an adult in the real world. Sure. But two, I think from a growth and learning perspective, it really showed me the upside in sort of taking a road less traveled. And I think just being surrounded by founders, operators of these startups who just had the we need to figure it out attitude, I think really left an impression on me. And so I did that for about a little more than a year, and then decided okay, I'm gonna go back and get my degree, sort of with the idea of wanting to be a software engineer. And again, more of right place, right time. Did a ton of different internships and jobs where I sort of landed in these teams that are kind of early stage or in really interesting transition periods. So I was one of the first batch of interns at Snap. I interned at Twitch right after the Amazon acquisition. And then ended up on Google Photos as a software engineer, right after Google had just acquired this startup. So the core team was still around, but that ended up being the startup that built out the sort of Google Photos product.
That's so cool.
And then, and it's just super just landed on my lap essentially. And I think around that time too, the idea of being a PM started kind of entering my mind. At that point, I think I really knew that I loved just working with people. I played basketball growing up, so I always loved the kind of team camaraderie, leadership aspects of business. And I think I was also just intensely curious about what were the other things that go into making a product or business successful beyond just the building. And so, decided to just sign on as a PM. I figured if I hated it, I could go back to being a software engineer. My first gig was building YouTube TV's advertising platform back when it was a fairly new product and only had subscription revenue. So it taught me a lot about sales and go-to-market there, which was really interesting. I then worked on Android for a little bit, kind of led some growth efforts and kind of the redesign of their kind of messaging app called Google Messages, where I was focusing on the conversation experience. And then,
Dude, the whole backstory up to this point already is amazing because, you look at the amount of time you spent there, you had a really good chance to see a lot of different elements of the business unit. You saw startups, you were at YCombinator, you were at the most prestigious engineering school, you made choices and pivots. And I think it like just shows that there's no direct linear path. A lot of people, a kid getting ready to go to college, and it's like they think through what that path is going to be, and it looks linear
Yeah.
to them, and it's like, well, you have to do this and then you have to do this, and it's like, well, no, you have to be curious and open to being able to accept new things. And that sounds like every step along the way you had the skill set, the knowledge, the curiosity, and the drive to accept all these new opportunities that were coming as new potential roads to travel, right?
Yeah, it's sort of like figuring out where your energy is and what's drawing you. And I think, and not to say like these were always like easy decisions, but it was always kind of like, okay, like, am I waking up excited? I don't know what like 2 or 3 months even are gonna look like, but if I could wake up every day and feel like I'm working towards something, I feel like some of these things tend to figure themselves out. But to just kind of like wrap up quickly, kind of like how I ended up building the business. I think my last gig at Google, I was pegged to start the kind of growth team for Google Photos that was specifically focused on acquiring more iOS users. And so, got a chance to move to New York. That was really exciting. And I think at that point too, I just had a lot of kind of close friends and colleagues who were also starting their own companies. And as part of just joining this growth team, I would just kind of go to them for advice, like, hey, like, we're starting this growth thing. I would love to learn like how you guys are thinking about go to market. How do you like, what are best practices, et cetera. And the sort of like exchange of information also led me to kind of take on some of these like advising roles. And really similar to, I think I got the same feeling I had when I took the gap year, which was just being surrounded by entrepreneurs, like people who just were unapologetically passionate about seeing this change in the world that they wanted and creating the outcomes they wanted. And I think that was really infectious. And so over time, like this thing that I was kind of doing on the side, like helping startups where I can, advising, et cetera, started drawing more and more of my excitement and energy, where there was this like job I loved doing 9 to 5, and all of a sudden that 9 to 5 seemed like a distraction from the thing I wanted to do most. And that's sort of like kind of, I think, what started me on this sort of entrepreneurial path. I'll pause there because I feel like I'm rambling a little bit, but
No.
we could talk a little bit about how that informed kind of Blossomer specifically.
Yeah, we'll get to that, and it's just fascinating because like every building block, every stone that you've hit, it's these are massive life events coming back to back, which is pretty outstanding to see. And you've seen these small startups to working at one of the largest companies on the planet, even though you're divisions of it, right? What are the big differences you see between working at that or working inside of an accelerator as an intern, working there, like at Y or with companies at YC, working at the largest one of the largest companies on the planet, and then starting your own company? So the whole spectrum. What are the big differences and challenges you see at each step?
Yeah, I think the term that comes to mind is sort of scaffolding. And scaffolding sort of can be like a good or bad thing. I'll start with Google, which, I think the perception is that tons of resources, tons of really smart people, and essentially you could think of the systems they have in place, the best practices, the people you get to work with, the resources they have at their disposal as like the scaffolding. And with great scaffolding, you could achieve a lot of kind of breadth of impact. Whereas, when you're starting your own business, and certainly when you're working at a startup, like much less scaffolding, you're sort of starting from the ground floor. But that also means that there's less of that structure, and that means you could change things on the fly and move and iterate. And so, I remember what I learned from growth was a lot of the advice that kind of like my friends were giving me in their growth practices. I remember thinking like, okay, this is great. We physically can't do that at Google because operating at that scale comes with a set of trade-offs and infrastructure decisions. And as much as I would love to kind of ship these changes like twice or 3 times a day, that just physically wasn't something I was able to do. And, but the kind of trade-off of that is that, any change you ship is going to impact like millions and millions of people. I think that's sort of like the fundamental trade-off of like reaching massive scale sort of feels like you need to move this like big tanker ship. And
Sure.
obviously if you have a smaller ship, you get to turn a lot faster.
Yeah, you're more agile, but you're more susceptible to waves, right? And one thing that we've seen is like in the small entrepreneurial world, you have these unlimited possibilities that you're trying to direct very limited resources at. And then when we see at large companies, you have, limited problems that you're trying to solve with significantly more resources, but you can't be as outside of the box as you'd want to be, right? So that there's limits on each side, which is kind of an interesting duality. There's the book called Loon Shots that talks about why that is, which is pretty good.
Yeah, that's a great book.
Yeah, it's really good, man. I'm glad that I think you and maybe one other person on the podcast has also read it. So it's my references land. So you started advising more businesses.
Yeah.
That's growing your passion. You're seeing that. And then you make the decision that you're going to leap. And some people will be like, this is crazy. Why would this person's in this dream scenario and they're leaping into this? So let's talk through that. Like, what was that process, that decision-making procedure? And then when you finally did it, what happened next?
Yeah. So I think going back to, what I talked about earlier about the 9-to-5 job started feeling like a distraction from the thing I wanted to do most. I learned this about myself too, which is like, I'm very bad at compartmentalizing in the sense of I could tell kind of my level of excitement showing up to work was just not there. And I think that was it was a very candid conversation I'd had with my manager, which is hey, I physically don't feel like the energy or the drive, or let's be candid, even my performance went from, I think, someone who took a lot of pride in being a high performer to being it's kind of hard for me to get up and want to do this, because it's there's this thing that after 5 o'clock I can go do, I want to do it now. And I think just seeing that felt like, okay, I can't continue down this path, because it's not just impacting me, but as a product manager, my energy is also impacting kind of the team and kind of their careers and their impact as well. And so I sort of knew that, all right, I'm going to have to kind of leave and kind of pursue this earnestly. And, so the center of gravity was always okay, what would enable me to kind of work more directly with these really intensely intelligent and passionate people. And then I knew that was my center of gravity. And then it was trying to figure out, what can I do to enable me to do that? And Derek, I think when we first connected and we first met, you kind of saw me going through that kind of transition, where I think we met because I had posted something on Indie Hackers or Reddit.
It was Reddit.
It was essentially hey, in PM, I do some advising for startups. Here's kind of what I've done. How can I help? I'm all ears. I just want to work with cool people. And I think over time, based off having those sort of conversations and also working really closely with kind of the other founders in my network, what I saw over and over again was even though I was getting introduced as the product or the growth guy, what I found, I think, at least the founders that I was working with, which tend to be really technical or product focused and early stage, was they always kind of struggled with sales and marketing. And they knew sales and marketing were really, really important because you need to generate demand for your product, but they were always sort of the second or third priority. And that meant that those areas were either being neglected entirely, or when they're being done, they weren't being executed to the same level of rigor that they would to the other sides of their business. And, demand generation isn't necessarily rocket science, not saying it's easy, but a lot of it is having that same test, analyze, and iterate approach, just like you would with product or engineering. And I think the best companies also apply that same level of analytical rigor. And the founders, I think, know this, but they just needed the extra support, extra set of helping hands, and the systems and expertise in place to deliver that, because they have a million other things on their plate. And so that's kind of that was the kind of insight that drove like the creation of Blossomer, which was like, I think I sort of pitch it as like, hey, think of us as your Iron Man suit for founder-led sales and early demand generation. And, we not only want to help founders get started with sales and have their first initial set of customers, but we want to help them build these systems and expertise in-house so that they can continue growing sustainably even after I think our engagement with them ends. And so that's kind of been the kind of insight that drove the business.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, especially like for these product folks, or founders. It's like they're going to do what's comfortable. They're going to do what they know. They're going to gravitate towards that. And then sales and marketing, it's like, I know it is important, but like that can be overwhelming if you don't know where to start. So it sounds like you offer a lot of value there. So you kind of have a series of taking leaps, like in your career. When you took the gap year, you left a really amazing job that so many people would like die to have to start this new exciting thing. Like what surprised you about those first like 90 days of really starting the company in earnest, where you were just like, maybe it was like Instagram versus reality. It's like, how did you think it was going to go versus like how it actually went? Any surprises?
What's funny was like, there are two things that surprised me, and they surprised me in a sense of like when my most intense feelings of stress came. The first was, I think, more intuitive, which is like the actual taking the leap was like stressful. I remember like after I told my manager, after I knew I was going to do this, like I pretty much told everyone at Google that I was going to do this, but like physically clicking the like I'm going to resign red button, I remember feeling like my heart was being out my chest and me thinking like, wait, like I've already said I'm going to do this. Why is this like one little button click driving me nuts?
The
but I remember the finality. But I remember after I did it, like especially in the early days where I was just kind of like in my cave, building out the landing page, playing with the business. That was like surprisingly like joyful and liberating with like, hey, like I wake up every day and like everything I'm doing is like for me. And I remember there was just like a lot of energy and passion. And I remember thinking, I thought it'd just be a lot more intense and stressful. And then what actually surprised me was the actual stress and pressure and kind of anxiety really only came as we started getting like traction and success. Because initially when I was like, because initially when it was just like an idea in my head, I told myself like, hey, I'm going to try this for a few months. Like worst case, it's like a sabbatical and I go get like another job or do something else, right? It's like a failed experiment. We can move on. But the moment you sort of, get people who are paying you, it's like not only are you delivering, but also figuring out like, wow, I really love this. And I really love this career path I'm taking. And I want to sustain this and grow this and have this thrive. And so that part I didn't really expect. I expected the kind of like ups and downs, et cetera. But the fact that the stress is coming from success and not failure, I think was really surprising for me.
Maybe like as really from like the PM perspective, like you're used to iterating, so it's like failing fast and figuring out what works and doesn't work. It's like you're used to that. Now it's like, oh, shoot, now I really got to scale. But I'm curious because you mentioned when you took your gap year, your parents were like, WTF, are you making a mistake? When you did that, when you left Google, were they also like, WTF? Or were they kind of like trusting you more at this point? And they're like, he's got it.
I love them to death. But I think naturally they kind of felt similar things. Cause like, I think I talked to them a lot about this too. I had a really great conversation with like a close friend of mine. And she said that when you're the child of immigrant parents, like I think every parent, end of the day, all they want is for you to be kind of happy. But I think especially immigrant parents who come in, given the conditions they're under, they have a very like narrow might not be the right word, but they have a very set view on like, okay, this is what it means to be happy. This is like the path you take. And when you deviate from that path, they sort of freak out because like, wait, what are you doing? Like, we want you to be happy. You have to go down this path. And I think my friend said something really profound to me at dinner, which was, I think it's sort of our roles as child of immigrants to show them like, hey, look, you took this brave step to move to this country. Like, look how many paths you've unlocked for us. It's not just the path that you thought, but it's sort of our job to show them like, look at this path that I'm going to take to build the sort of like life that you've wanted me to live, and the fulfillment and the learning and the joy and things like that. And so it's not like my parents were like freaking out, but I remember there was a lot of like, hey, like let me be mindful and thoughtful and like kind of walk you through this journey. And yeah, I think they're coming around. At least they're hiding the anxiety well, at least.
Oh, it's all you can ask for from parents, you know?
Yeah.
So we have somewhat similar backgrounds in that we're both electrical engineer, computer science. We both went into product management. We're really focused on like growth. So we, I really love hearing your story and hearing how you navigated through it. And then one of the things that you mentioned is the customers you work with, especially very technical founders. And I have to fight through this a lot of times too. It's like you want to focus on the problem you're solving, and then they can like, I can make this grow via product-led growth. I can, if I build it, people will come, right? And they just think that everyone's going to notice how great it is. But as a product manager and as a growth person, your role is to say, we need to get this in front of as many target people as possible, so we're not building the wrong thing. You probably had to go through that at Google, but in the new business with your new client base, have you had to help nudge their ship in a different direction as they've met the market with their product?
Yeah, definitely. I think what's been really interesting too, and I didn't have this initial insight, but I think a pair of founders actually educated me on this, and it's actually become a point of education for me too, which is like, there's this really common misconception that, hey, we should not think about like sales or demand generation until our product is like quote unquote ready. But what I've sort of realized too is that sales can just be a really vital part of early customer discovery and product validation. So like if you think of the combination, if you think of kind of product market fit as a symbiotic relationship between like the persona you're targeting, the problem you're trying to solve for them, the product solution you're delivering, and to some degree kind of like what price you're charging. The same kind of like systematized data-driven approach you would apply for like a scaling organization with sales, like consistent outreach, content creation, high quality customer conversations, and being really rigorous about it. That same process that generates demand for those sort of companies can actually be applied to these early stage companies in order to get signal on those 4 components. And by doing that and having that system in place sooner rather than later, you get a lot more shots on goal. You get a lot more repetitions to feel out, hey, is this the right customer? Is this the right problem? Are we building the right solution? Is our business model correct? And not only that, but you also kind of start getting practice on how you message and position your product. And so I think sort of right now, a lot of the mindset is like, I'll build my product, I'll launch it, we'll see what happens, and then we'll think about kind of sales and marketing, et cetera. But I've seen a lot of kind of impact and success from, I think, earlier stage founders bringing us on, even on the 0 to 1 phase, and thinking, oh, okay, we're not totally sure this is like actually the right product roadmap or strategy to go down. Like, how can we test this hypothesis? And doing a lot of that, like sales outreach, that marketing, even sometimes the content creation can give you a lot of signal on whether or not you're chasing the right problem.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And are you applying that same process for your own demand generation and growth as you're growing your business? Or are you getting more in from referral? What mechanism are you using to drive your own funnel?
Yeah, I mean, referrals is like a big part of it, but what's been really nice too is, for me getting customers, I'm applying the same sort of like test, analyze, and iterate tactics to kind of get demand get the attention of founders and help them sell their product. And what's really nice too is like, once I'm in the room, it's like, hey, you know how I got myself in the room? I can help you guys get in the room with some of your key customers as well. And sort of a lot of the like early work or a lot of the kind of like demo proving out whether or not it's a good fit or not is me kind of selling their own product to them, kind of helping them see like, here's how I would sell your product, here's how I would position it. And sometimes having that outsider's perspective and seeing, oh, here's how I interpreted their value propositions in my mind, and here's how I would enhance and augment it to a customer potentially like me or a customer that's different, has been really helpful in giving them a sense of, oh, here's the value he can bring, and here's what potentially working with him could be like. So yeah, it's all really symbiotic, which I really like.
So I was just thinking about how you guys met, which I think was Reddit. Is that right? Derek did actually tell me. I think that's really cool. I was wondering if, like, in your like working with clients, or even in your own sort of outreach, are there any like non-traditional channels or unexpected places where you're sort of making these connections and prospecting?
I don't think anything super unconventional. It's just, I think I was talking to Derek earlier via email, but it's like, I think a lot of it has come from, I think, word of mouth referral, and then LinkedIn and email outreach. There's been some that, like, you do the outreach and then they either like watch a video that I was kind of like a part of, like some interview, or like a blog post that I wrote back in the day. But I think it's kind of your traditional like multi-channel demand generation, multiple customer touch point type thing. So yeah, not doing anything super crazy there, I don't think.
No, I think it'll work. Go ahead, Derek.
No, sorry. Yeah, we've seen some weird stuff that, like, some of the very, very unconventional stuff tends to really work. Well, and what I mean by that is, like, mailing physical stuff to people now tends to really work, which is kind of weird to think about because there's so much digital noise. But
yeah,
one of the things you mentioned before, you talked about value props, and we run into this, I don't know, Lauren, 9.9 times out of 10, the companies that we work with, we're helping product teams, we're helping marketing teams get that growth too. You're focusing a lot on that sales aspect, but their value props are clumsy, confusing, or they bury the lead in all of their communications, right? Like their webpage, it's like, I don't know what you do. And they're like, oh no, it's obvious, we do this. And it's like, okay, what you just said and what I would find under my own accord are two very different things, right? So like really nailing that value prop, yours for your company is clean. You can say it in half a tweet, right?
Yeah.
And you can tell that to your mother and your father, and then they can tell one of their friends, and that can become a lead. But if it's too complicated, that's not going to land with anybody, and nobody can have any communication to be like, hey, talk to this person. I'm assuming you experience that with your client base right now too, like nailing that first, right?
Yeah, definitely. And what's nice is sort of when my first interaction with them, oftentimes the sort of value prop that resonates with me was not totally obvious to them. And so having an outsider come in and being like, hey, like, you're really burying the lead. Like, you should be highlighting this desired outcome or this pain point and this value proposition, I think has been really helpful. Again, like, I think this is why the thinking about outreach and sales and marketing early and not just building in a vacuum is really, really important. Because, like, imagine that's like 3 or 6 months where they assumed like the messaging or value prop is one thing, and they could have like tested and iterated that like well before they like launched the thing on Product Hunt, like 6 months down the line.
Sure.
And they could have been in like a much better place. So yeah, I think I underestimated the value in just like, oh yeah, just having an outsider come in and just like vet your messaging and things like that can be really effective.
One thing that Lauren usually does, anytime I write anything, effectively, she takes the whole document and flips it upside down, because I write in this like deep story that builds to a conclusion. And she's like, conclusion, supporting information, right? And then we see all the customers do that too. We'll look at web pages and it will be this whole story of explaining the problem. And then way at the bottom, what they do. It's just like, whoop, like flip
it's like
that
a
order.
journalism technique called like the inverted pyramid. So you lead with the lead, and then the rest of the stuff, it can come later.
I definitely have that problem too. I think a lot of it comes from, one, I think having an engineering background that's like very logical flow. And two, I think just being very type A, where it's like, we want to like, we're taught to show our work in school. And we're like, hey, like, look how analytically rigorous I'm being to come to this conclusion. And more often than not, people are just like, just tell me the answer, dude. Like, and if I care, like, put in the appendix. So I feel like just communication in general is something we're always working on, no matter what you're doing.
Yeah. It's the smart person problem of, I want to show you how clever I am that I arrived at this conclusion. And it's just like, but people are going to walk in and out of that meeting. They're going to leave. They're going to abandon your webpage. Tell me the thing. Give me the answer right away. And then tell me why you think that's the answer. And like, that's been one of the biggest biggest points, not only to help our customer base, but to help ourselves, like being able
Yeah.
to really narrow down what we do. It's like people talk about the elevator pitch, like you don't even have that much time anymore. You
Yeah.
have
Attention
10
span.
words. Yeah.
Mhm.
Are you utilizing things like TikTok or anything like that for your clients or you, or what social media channels are you putting content out on?
Yeah. You mean for myself or for clients
For both.
specifically?
For both. Where do
Yeah.
you see that
Well,
momentum going?
yeah. I mean, I think everyone is on LinkedIn right now, it seems. So
Mhm.
like a lot of activity there, both for myself and for I think like kind of the clients I work with. Like email and LinkedIn are sort of like our sweet spot.
Mhm.
And but to your point, it's like I think we're starting to see the trend where these like low low effort, high reach sort of things become very saturated. And that means that like things like Instagram, kind of more visual marketing, Reels, or even TikTok become more appealing. We haven't like sort of like deep dive into that yet. I think given the
Mhm.
sort of stage of companies I work with, there's one client where I think uh, that sort of channel could be really, really appealing, and thus I'm kind of like trying to find folks that can help with kind of content creation for the video side.
Mhm.
But yeah, I think it's sort of what you alluded to earlier, Derek. Whereas, like especially now with AI making content creation so easy, there's going to be a proliferation of that stuff,
Yeah.
and having something that's like has more taste and I think just more effort put in can really differentiate you. And so that's something I think about a lot as well.
Yeah, and I think I agree. It's like every time a platform really grows, it grows with this amazing organic content, and then it saturates so much. And it's like
Yeah,
at no point in history have we had the ability to reach out to more people. And if at no point or at no point in history has it been harder to have your message land with an individual, right?
yeah,
Because it's you have so much other noise going there too. But yeah, I think you're right. I think we have the similar approach. It's like everyone that matters is on LinkedIn. If you make valuable things, valuable insights there, and you participate in the community without being a
yeah,
spam bot, that makes a lot of sense and can get you a lot of growth and awareness. And if you can individually reach out to people that are in your target market and not hit them with a 10-page email, you can
yeah.
probably get a conversation with people that you think you probably can't.
Yeah. And I think the thing to keep in mind too is like people this applies to like all aspects of life, not just business, but like people have just very good BS radars. And like I think the
Yeah.
moment you come across as like disingenuous or transactional, it's like the fastest way just to lose credibility. And so I always try to keep in mind, both for like my own outreach efforts as well as like when I reach out on behalf of startups and things like that, of like, hey, like what is the value I'm providing with this like interaction? And is this like a genuine kind of attempt at creating some partnership that benefits both parties? Because I think the moment it seems like, hey, I'm reaching out because like you can help me and I'm going to
Mhm.
pretend it'll help you, people can snuff that out very quickly.
No, I think it's a really good point. Like authenticity is going to shine through because there's so much BS
Yeah.
that's thrown out there, and so it kind of makes you a differentiator in a
Yeah.
sense. When you are doing that outreach, like, are you looking at certain verticals or industries? Like, are you honing in on those? And then how did you go about sort of figuring out what that niche is for you?
Yeah, lots of trial and error. I think we sort of land at a sweet spot where it's sort of like Series A and before, seed, pre-seed, teams usually like fewer than 15 people, don't really have like a sales hire yet, um, and with sort of like founders who have backgrounds are either like really technical or really product focused. So that's sort of like
Mm.
the firmographic thing. Um, what I've been thinking more about too, as we kind of think about supporting more founders, is that's sort of like the attributes that would tell you they probably have some sort of need for sales and marketing. But like I think a big component of Blossomer too is that you know I want to be working really closely with the founders themselves, and I almost want it to feel like a true partnership. It's almost like you have like a co-founder.
Yeah.
But what's harder to sort of tease out is like, what is that working relationship actually going to be like? And you don't really know based off just research, and you don't really know candidly until like, I think 2 or 3 sessions in of like whether or not there's like a good working fit. And, given the sort of like limited time and kind of resources and my desire to kind of keep the client list small, like each engagement has sort of high opportunity cost. And so that's kind of like one of the things I've been thinking about as well, which is like, are there sort of systematic ways I can do a better job vetting that working relationship? Like right now, the best way is referrals. But curious to figure out or learn if there are like other tactics as well.
Yeah, no, I think we talked about this early on when we were first chatting back in the Reddit days.
Yeah.
It was like, you can do the approach, which is blast out, have a customer acquisition cost of $200 and then have a $3,000 engagement once and then move on to the next one and just keep churning that. But that's not conducive of what we like to do or our relationships. And it's not what you want to do either. So it's like you have more time to nurture, more time to really grow, because you don't want a 30-day engagement. You want a 12, 18-month engagement, install the next team, and then be a trusted advisor after it. So you can spend more time, but your shots on goal, it's not a spray and pray approach then, right? Your shots on goal are very targeted, which you can build a framework around. I think we talked about this too. It's like you have these frameworks you can install to put you on first base quickly. And you mentioned it for product management. Like when you walk in, it's like, hey, this is the framework I'm going to deploy for product management. This is for growth. This is how I'm going to put a system in place to make this actually manageable and repeatable for when I'm not here. Do you have those kind of processes that you just like, hey, I'm going to use this, this, and this. This is stage one, and we're going to execute through it? Is that how you approach an engagement?
Somewhat. It's not as I'm always a little wary of just like over indexing on like playbooks and templates, because like kind of every situation is unique. But I think, Derek, like what you kind of highlighted is sort of high level where I'm trying to get to, which is, oftentimes like when we get brought on, there's like a very specific thing that the founders have in mind, which is, for example, like you could get brought on because, hey, we need someone to kind of like ramp up improve the messaging on our landing page, or someone wants to produce content more consistently, or someone says, hey, we need to be a lot more systematic with kind of like email outreach and do it more consistently and apply more analytical rigor. And so I think where I'm at now is like, how can I take some of these like starter projects like that, they'll bring me on, and then how can I use that as like a launching pad into these systems and conversations they need to have around these other parts of demand generation. And I think what the most kind of successful engagements have been, and the ones for founders that have like really started to see traction in the system working, is around like the 2 or 3 month point. I would say like I was brought on to help with email outreach. And around like 1 month in, we start seeing that, hey, like this pain point or this talking point or this value proposition is really resonating. Let's take these learnings and let's apply it to your landing page, your marketing, the content you're producing. That's when you start seeing the kind of like test, analyze, and iterate approach start paying dividends in the long term. And not only that too, but it's like, now that I have a month or two in of working with these founders, you start really getting a feel for how they make decisions, how to work together, how they work with me. But again, it's like, to your point, it's like we're a business that's not built on the like, hey, low CAC and then 1 month and we're out. We're sort of the like, hey, like this sort of the value we add gets better the longer we work together. And so I think that's a thing that we're very mindful of.
I was going to say, is it hard to, you're speaking to really analytical people and they're like, we want to see, like, maybe they want to see results because they fully don't understand like the process. So it's like, how do you kind of win that business if that's an objection? Is there anything you've kind of tuned in?
I think it's, again, being just like really authentic and honest about like expectations of like, hey, like, here's what I think we can get to, but like, hey, I'll be perfectly candid. Like your first set of email campaigns or first set of ads, conversion rates aren't going to be really high. But I think it's showing them that, hey, even though these first couple of things aren't going to quite meet these like very high expectations that we should have, it's the like, it's much more about the like pace of learning and momentum. And so it's like, hey, this email campaign failed. And, you know, that could still be really valuable in the sense like, okay, we know not to talk about that, or that particular thing doesn't resonate. And there's probably other aspects of like, say, your sales script or your landing page that we could start kind of paring down that as well. So I think rightfully clients should be very outcome and kind of metrics focused. But I think there's an aspect of also showing them that, hey, the rate of learning is like meaningfully increasing as well, which I think is kind of the value we provide.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think, yeah, when you have those founders and you can talk to them about, we're going to take the hypothesis-based problem-solving approach that you're doing for innovation, and we get to apply it to your messaging and marketing as well. And actually, we'll even put it inside of a sprint, and you're going to see wins and losses along the way. But that's going to get you your long-term ultimate result, because we're playing the long game. What is it? Simon Sinek calls it the infinite game. We're not doing this for a month. We're not going to try to show you artificial vanity metrics of look how many impressions per dollar you got. We're looking at a long game of what your business could potentially be. No, I love it. I love the approach. I love what you guys are doing. I'm really excited to see where the future goes. And that kind of leads us to this part of the conversation where if you could give yourself advice when you're younger, what would that be? You have dinner with yourself, a younger version of you, all the twists and turns you've taken to get where you're going to be. What does that conversation look like?
Yeah. And I think as someone that I think like grew up with immigrant parents and then went to MIT, went to Google, it's like I think even though I wasn't totally aware of it at the time, like I think the imposter syndrome or the like feeling like I needed to like live up to something and prove myself was always there. And I sort of, after doing some reflection, I sort of realized that I think the specific advice I'd give myself is to have, I think, more self-confidence to question conventional wisdom. You know, it doesn't mean that you ignore advice or best practices, but I think so often we see examples of what other people do, and there's a lot of societal pressure to kind of like just do what that expert told you or do best practices as a way to kind of shortcut thinking about what's actually best for us given our unique circumstances. And I think part of it too is the like, especially when you kind of are suffering imposter syndrome, there's always the like excuse of like, well, like it didn't work out, but like, you know, I did what I was supposed to, so it's okay. But I think about like kind of the sort of my personal life and things I did in my career, which I think a lot of it we've talked about already, but they were always these instances where I paused and asked like, okay, let's set aside what I'm supposed to do or what everyone else is telling me. Like, where's the energy? Like, what's actually the right thing given my goals for my personal life, my career, my learning objectives, and the unique circumstances I'm experiencing. And I realized just like the times where I was able to do that were the times when I felt like I learned the most, I grew the most, and kind of had the most energy day to day. And so I think the advice I give myself is like, hey, like, you know, don't be afraid to do that. Trust yourself more, to lean into going against the grain.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And if more people followed it, or more people were brave enough to take those jumps, their lives would be so much more fulfilled, other than, I can't do that. That's for somebody else. No, it's for you. Like, you can do that. Try it. And the consequence, Lauren and I talk about this a lot, the consequences of failure are so much lower than anyone could possibly ever imagine because of the fear that you have built inside you. Like, it's not that bad. I mean, there are a few things that are fatal, so you avoid those. But if you can make survivable tests, the consequences aren't that bad.
Yeah. And I think I either read or listened to, like, Tim Ferriss has his like fear setting exercise where it's like, here's this decision you're pondering, and you just spend 30 minutes, like, write down every single bad thing that can happen for like the bad outcome. And then spend another 5 minutes like, okay, if this happens, what will I do? And I think just the act of having it on paper kind of makes you realize like, okay, actually, yeah, like even if this thing happens, like there are things I could do to make it not as bad. And because like I think even before that, like I always characterize myself as like a fairly risk adverse individual. So I think I think if you told me even like a year and a half ago, it's like, hey, you're gonna kind of start your own company, et cetera, I'd be like, I don't see Phil doing that. There's no way. He's way too risk adverse. Like he like overthinks things, and he's gonna weigh pros and cons. But also just like, I think here I am. I think because of the like what you said, Derek, it's the like failure isn't as fatal as people make it out to be.
Yeah, I think we make it like more like a monster, but then writing it out and visualizing, you're like, oh, it's actually not that serious. You just kind of go into like a little bit of a spiral. But I also think it's funny that you call yourself risk averse when you have done some pretty risky things. I mean,
I know.
Almost dropped out of MIT, joined a startup.
Yeah, that's so funny. Well, speaking of Tim Ferriss, big podcast fan. What podcasts do you love to listen to? What kind of books would you recommend? What's on your playlist? That sort of thing.
Yeah. Oh man, I'm a big podcast consumer, and I try to read every day. I think one of my favorite podcasts that I think most people don't actually know about that I really enjoyed is called Tangled. It's by this guy named Isaac Saul. And I'm not particularly political, but what I really love about his podcast, it's also a newsletter. But essentially he'll take like a news event and he'll summarize, here's what the right is saying about it, here's what the left is saying about it, and then here's my like very biased point of view as like a Jewish person who lives in, I think, Philadelphia now. And what I really loved about that is like, yes, it gives you kind of both sides of the issue, but I think it's a really consistent example of someone that's very self-aware and able to kind of think through the nuances of things that I find to be just like really impressive. And so for me, it's like a great way to kind of consume the news. And he's also a fantastic writer, and also I think just very exemplary as like a very kind of like fantastic individual in terms of being able to handle the nuances. In terms of books, concept. Yeah, it's great. I definitely recommend it. In terms of books, the last book I just finished was this book called Connected. By Carol Robin and I think David Bradford. They're husband and wife, and they're professors at Stanford Business School, and they teach this really famous course called Touchy Feely. And it's just, I think, like a really practical book about how to build stronger relationships and connect more with people. And yeah, I really, really kind of enjoyed the book. And I've definitely seen it kind of pay dividends in sort of like my own personal and professional relationships. So highly recommend it.
I like that. I like that a lot. It's like, really cool. That resonates with me, being an engineer, very analytical, very problem solving, like finding ways to relate to humans and being able to have relationships is always great. So it's a really good list. I like that a lot. Yeah. Phil, we really appreciate you coming on. Who would have thought that a Reddit thread between me browsing between pizza, cars, and business topics would connect us? But I'm really excited it did. Really great insights. Loved hearing your story from, school, coming from immigrant parents, founding your own business. Really great. Can't wait to see what you guys do in the future. And we're really excited to potentially, attack problems together. We'll talk more about video after this, but really excited to have you on. And thanks so much for joining.
Yeah, thank you, Derek. Thank you, Lauren. This is super fun. Thank you so much for having me on.